I've been at Ironwood since 2017. There are some people on staff, pastors, who I've never heard speak. There are some who I've heard speak a couple handful of times, and you and Seth preach a lot. How do you determine the preachers on the team or who is getting to preach on Sundays?
So I want to have people preach who are really gifted to preach or who are really developing their giftedness to preach. So the guys that you haven't heard preach, it's because either they have preached at different points and it was fine, or because they don't really aspire to have that be a major part of their work. Now, I do think every pastor, a part of the qualifications of 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 is you have to be able to teach. I don't think that means necessarily you need to be able to hold people's attention and communicate dynamically for 35 minutes from a stage. I don't think that is important. But that's how I think about it. So the people you've heard preach some, it's usually because we see some giftedness there that we want to see cultivate and grow and develop. Seth and I preach a lot because that's some of our core strengths and core giftedness. But what I think about a lot is how many times a year could this person be a good preacher in this kind of church? And there's a lot of variables there, right? This person is pretty steady. What a good preacher is in a certain kind of church, maybe that's size, maybe that's context, maybe that's whatever, might change. Like we've got a guy on our staff who I don't think, you've probably heard him preach. He's preached a few times. I think he would be a great preaching pastor at a church of about 150 people. But in our environment, where we're about 1,900 people and we have the other communicators we have, he can do an effective sermon once every year, once every 2 years, something like that. So that's a little bit what I mean. How consistently can you be effective? How many times a year can you be effective? That's how I would think about it.
Welcome back to the Preaching Through podcast. My name's Dave. This is Luke. Every episode is all about preaching through modern day following Jesus. That's it. Just how do you preach God's word in such a way that compels and motivates and inspires, really coming alongside what God has said and just serving that up in a way that folks can say, I get that, and that's what I want. That's what this podcast is all about. We want to be one voice in that process, hopefully not the only voice, but just one of several voices that you have. Michael Lukaszewski, head of Church Fuel, he says, if you listen to too many people, it'll be chaos. If you listen to one person, you'll be a robot. You really want to have just a few voices. And I just like that illustration, and that's what I hope for this podcast. Today, we're talking all about the idea of the team. So it really leans into multiple voices, maybe in that preaching process. We're not talking so much about how would those multiple voices come together and, coordinate on a particular sermon. We talked about that in previous episodes. What we are talking about is the actual structure of the team. And before we get into that, I think a lot of preachers will hear the idea of team and immediately they'll think like, yeah, because you want times off. Well, there's more to it than that. But from that aspect, Luke, how many weeks of preaching in a row is your idea in our environment? Is your ideal amount in our environment?
Well, there's two ways to look at it. One is how many times a year could I be an effective preacher? That's one question. Another question is how many weeks in a row could I do it without it starting to feel like a drain? So I think I could be an effective preacher 40, maybe 45 weeks a year. I've never preached 45 weeks a year because I don't want to do that. Part of me would like to do that, but I think different people could be good in different contexts, different amounts. Now, in terms of every week, that's something that's changed for me. So one of the things that I realized in the first couple of years of church planting and pastoring was that I would preach on Sunday, and that night I would think, oh man, I get to do it again next week. And then the next week would come and it's like, oh man, I get to do it again next week. And after about week 9 in a row, that Sunday night I would go, oh man, I can't believe I have to do it again next week. And so that's about where that was. And so once I noticed that pattern, I went, you know what? I should just not get to that point. I should make sure I schedule someone else by week 9 so I don't get to that point. Then over time, as we started adding more services and some of those dynamics, I found that number actually shrank for me. So that number went down to about 6.
So going from preaching one time to preaching multiple times on a day.
On a Sunday, yeah.
On a Sunday.
Like, as we added services, so now I preach 3 services, and I find I can now go about 5 weeks where I'm still in I get to do it next week. And at about week 6, I start to go, oh man, I can't believe I have to do it again next week. So that's changed over time. And so that's how I think about that.
What would you say is the most you would like to take off? Like, be gone 2 weeks in a row, 4 weeks in a row from preaching, 6 weeks. What's the ideal we're not talking sabbatical, vacation.
Yeah.
I'm talking like August through May of a normal year.
A lot of times I'll be gone at most during the normal year. Like, at most I wouldn't preach 2 weeks in a row.
Mm-hmm.
Occasionally it's been 3, especially if I'm like traveling, for like a international mission trip kind of thing or something. But normally it would be about 2 weeks in a row. There is something about the second week off of preaching that you really, in those 2 weeks, if you're thoughtful about it, you're able to get some other leadership stuff really done in those weeks. So that's nice. But yeah, I mean, for me, typically it might be 1 week, it might be 2, that sort of thing.
Having regularly scheduled weeks where you're not preaching, those are great. Why do you think those are great for recovery in some sense? But like, why do you think it's so exhausting to teach or preach? I know that when I give presentations, like, albeit a different context, different content, but I know it wipes me out as well. Why is it so exhausting? You're just talking.
Isn't that one of the weirdest things? It is like that. Like, even times when you just preach once on a Sunday and you're like, man, I took a killer nap because I was so tired. Yeah, I think some of it is the stress of it. Some of it is the adrenaline. And then some of it is the spiritual pressure. I think there is something spiritual happening in it. I think there's also a dynamic of you're not just preaching the word. Most of the time, you're also giving of yourself. You're giving a lot of your energy. You're giving a lot of your presence. You're giving a lot of your emotion. And, so it's that exchange. It's that effort that I think is more intense than if you're giving a lecture on math, or if you're even a person who, like, you have the same keynote presentation you just give every time. At some point it becomes a little bit routine, but every week you're coming up with something fresh and deep, hopefully, and so that's hard.
A few years ago, a new pastor joined our team. He'd been on staff at another church for a number of years, had a lot of experience preaching. And before he preached for the first time at our church, I said, hey, after your sermon, we'll sit down and just debrief it and talk it through. And we did that. And I was able to give him some coaching feedback that just to me felt totally normal. But afterward, he said something that blew my mind. He said, I got more feedback from you after that one sermon than I've gotten all these other years that I've been involved in preaching. Now that stunned me. I grew up in an environment where you got lots of feedback, you got lots of coaching, but I realized that's actually not a common experience for most pastors. Most of us, we only get a little bit of a, hey, pastor, that was pretty good, or we get a nasty email, neither one of which are very helpful. And so I've created an experience where you can have the same kind of experience that he had, getting some tangible feedback as well as some really practical instruction on how to build and craft and deliver great sermons that are consistent week after week. I want to encourage you, I want to help you, and I want to come alongside any way I can. You don't need an overhaul, but a few small tweaks might go a long way to helping you be the preacher God made you to be, helping you find your voice, and helping you to serve the people God's called you to lead. So that's what the Preaching Lab Live is all about. To find out more, go to faithfulandfruitful.com/lab.
Why would a lead pastor want to have a preaching team at the church?
One reason would be what we've already referred to, is just so you don't wear yourself out. I actually, right now, the last few years, I've preached about 32, 33 weeks. I'd like to preach more, actually. It's not like I need that much rest. But that takes me to the next reasons why you'd want it, is I think there's really value in developing multiple voices, developing a plurality of people. I think all leadership should happen with some kind of plurality and team. And so to have other preachers who are bringing other perspectives, who are bringing other life experiences, who are bringing other lenses at which they're looking at different things, to have them and have them be effective, it's really great. Like, there's times where I'll sit and I'll listen to Seth Trout, or, in the years before when Josh Watt, who has since gone on to plant a church, when he was part of our preaching team, I would listen to those guys and think, man, I would have never thought to use that illustration. I would have never thought of that application. I would have never seen that. Oh man, that's really good. And I really like it because they're not trying to imitate me. They're not trying to be me. It's not like, they're just a worse version of me. They're a totally different version. That's a great version of themselves. And so I think that's just a gift. The other thing that I think happens is, even if you're a preacher who you were like, say you were going to preach 40 weeks a year, and so you got 12 weeks where you need to fill it. If you have some sort of team where at least there's one other person who's preaching 6 or 7 times a year, and then you're filling the other 4 or 5 messages with just one-offs, well, that's more cohesive than if you preach 40 times a year and there's 12 standalone messages by random whoever's. And so I think it is about providing a complementary voice, but also a cohesive voice, so that it doesn't, church week after week doesn't start to feel every month like it's just some random event.
Oh, pastor's got the day off,
yeah,
type thing.
Yeah, National Youth Pastor Sunday is what I call, the Sunday after Christmas, that kind of a thing. And, that's fine. And everybody does that at some point, but if you can have a good preaching team, then it starts to never feel like there's a throwaway week. It never you feel like someone could invite a friend any week and we would feel really good about what they're going to experience. And there's something compelling about that.
Well, even on that Sunday after Christmas, we do what has become a favorite Sunday of so many people. It's the Ask Anything. And even within the context of that, it's typically you, Seth, and Matthew, all 3 highly visible throughout the entire year. So it doesn't feel like it's a throwaway week. It doesn't feel like it's a phoning in. Well, but it's also probably a little bit of a break too.
Yeah, there's no prep on it, right?
Right.
It's a thing where people just text in live questions and we answer on the fly. And so there's a high wire act. I like that because we're doing it as a team. Like if it was just me, that would feel like too much pressure to be Mr. Bible Answer Man. As a team, it works. The other thing, though, I found is there were a number of years where I would ask a youth pastor or ask another person on our team, hey, would you do it? I just ruined their Christmas.
Yeah.
Because now, on one hand, they get an opportunity to preach. On the other hand, they're having to prep it during that week of Christmas, and they're not used to prepping it very well. They don't have a great system for doing it. It's highly inefficient, and it's highly stressful for them and for their wife. And I realized this is actually adding too much stress for everybody. And we could do something that's more interesting if we just do the Ask Anything.
So with all the people who do preach on Sunday morning, you and Seth will come up. Well, hey, how you doing? My name's Luke. I'm part of our preaching team. Hi, I'm Seth. I'm part of the preaching team here. But then that's it. That's just when Josh Watt was here. Hi, I'm Josh Watt. I'm part of the preaching team. But that's it.
And Josh Yasuda right now is our student pastor, and he probably this year preached 3 or 4 times. But he doesn't say that.
He doesn't say it.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Why?
Because he's not on the preaching team.
Why is he not on the preaching team?
So the way I think about this, and people could disagree or not, but I think that you have to preach at least 6 times a year to be considered on the team. Otherwise, you're one of the pastors and you're not filling in, but you're kind of filling in, So that's how I think about it. 6 is a very arbitrary number, but if you think about it, that's at least every other month. So that's, if you did it that way, that could be fairly consistent. So that's how I think about it. And in Josh's case, as a student pastor, he's a very good preacher. I mean, he's gifted enough where he could certainly preach more than just 3 or 4 times a year. But he's preaching many weeks in student ministry. And as Seth keeps improving, he wants more weeks and I want more weeks for him. And at some point it's a little bit like a basketball team, but there's only one basketball, and so that's how we think about that. And I'm not saying we wouldn't add Josh or someone else to the team at some point, but that's how I think about it. If someone preaches over 6 times a year, they're on the team.
So how will you sync up regardless of who's preaching, whether it's Josh once every other month, whether it's you 32 times a year, Seth, or even a guest speaker that might periodically come in? Like, how do you sync up with other speakers, and what is it important? What do you find important to have in sync?
Well, I sync it up by I control and oversee the pulpit as a whole. So our preaching calendar, the breakdown of the passages. Now I'll do that with the team and in, community. I'm not just doing that off by myself entirely, but I have the final responsibility of that. And so as Seth and I, with work with our elders to determine our preaching calendar, and here's our schedule, and here's what we're doing. We'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. And then what I'll do is go through and make that preaching calendar and, assign different weeks to different people. Typically, I'm assigning them. And then we have a sermon insight meeting, so that helps keep people in sync. There are times where, headed into a new series, we'll just have a short little meeting and go, all right, here's the thing that we're really trying to accomplish with this. I've had times where Seth will sit down with me and say, all right, in this particular message, as you think about me preaching this one, is there something you're really hoping to see this particular message do in relation to the rest of the series? And that's the kind of thing. If we have a guest speaker and they're coming and they're going to preach as part of the series, then I'm informing them of those things as well. But it's pretty straightforward, especially because for us, most of the time we're preaching through a book of the Bible, and it's like, all right, here's the next chunk. Here's the next chunk. Here's the next chunk.
Even within that, it doesn't sound like there's a great effort that goes through, here's what we said in week 1, here's what we said in week 2, you've got to say this in week 3 because we're saying this in 4 and 5 and 6. Like, it doesn't sound like syncing up is to that extent. It just sounds more like, here's
it depends
1,
on the series. So in our Revelation episode, we talked about how there were those phrases we kept saying. We're not on the planning committee, we're on the welcoming committee, right? This isn't as much about predicting as it is preparing. Well, those were things we decided, hey, Revelation's a big deal. This needs to really be cohesive. There's some things we want to remind each other of along. So like that was an example where we said, okay, we do want to try to say that every week. I think that's much more important if you're doing shorter topical series, right? If you're doing a topical series that's arranged in a much more creative way, then you're going to have to do a little bit more syncing up and collaboration around, like, you maybe need to write up like a series brief that explains, here's what is trying to happen on this week and on that week, and here's the key things we're going to repeat and that sort of thing. So that could be a really helpful resource. And we've done that at different points when we're doing more of a theology or a thematic message or series.
I think I just probably, being on the outside looking in, I probably think there's more to it than what there actually is. Not to downplay it at all.
Some of it right now, Dave, is Seth and I mean, sober-mindedly, we're both highly competent at this. Like, he could absolutely be a lead pastor and preach every week. So could I. So the level of direction that he needs is very little compared to and I know we're going to talk about this at the end. Okay, if I'm just by myself, but I want to build a team, how do I get there? Well, when you get there and you realize, okay, these are folks that they're not ready to preach 20 weeks a year like Seth could. They're not ready to, they actually could preach 40 weeks a year. That's how good they are. They're more inexperienced. Well, then there needs to be more handholding. There probably needs to be more of a series brief. There needs to be more of those. Part of the sermon insight meetings would be to go, hey, now remember, here's something we're saying every week. Here's something we're emphasizing. I did early on with Seth as he was joining our team. One of the feedback things I had to give him regularly was like, hey, you preach that message as though it were a standalone message. And I do need you to reference the series we're in, reference how we're part of this whole thing, reference what we're doing in this series. And so I was more directive with him when he was newer. And now that he's more established and better, I don't need to do that as much.
That's helpful for me to hear, because as I was listening to you talk, I was thinking, well, I think it's just to me, it seems like he's making it a lot easier for anyone listening who's like, yeah, I need to sync up with it. It doesn't have to be super complex and this drawn out thing. And it's like, oh, I don't want to bring anyone in because I don't want to have to bring them up to speed. And that's just so, but it seems like it doesn't have to be over directed, but there's room for some direction. And maybe, we will talk more about that as we get towards the end here.
You want to set up whoever's preaching for success.
Yeah.
Like I don't want them to do well so that I look good that they do well. I want them to do well so that the congregation trusts their leadership, right? As I think about the people who are part of our staff, part of our team, that they're seen as a leader in our church, I want people to have a good experience of them. That's one of the reasons why I don't put up our lay elders to preach, right? Some people would have a problem with that. And they go like, your lay elders should preach every week. Or this particular guy, how come he's never preached? Because if he preached, you would think less of him. And you shouldn't think less of him because he's a great leader and he's a great shepherd. He's a very godly man and he's great teaching in a certain environment, but he isn't great in teaching on Sunday. And so for your ability to trust his leadership, I'm going to actually protect him from preaching because you wouldn't feel very good about his leadership. And so I don't want to do that. I want to put people up there who have gifts that are established or are developing. And at some point, if someone's like, hey, like they're just not very good, and that doesn't serve them or the church. Sometimes I've heard of this. I don't think I know too many people that actually think like this, but I've heard of pastors that maybe will try to have someone be not very good so that people appreciate how good they are, which just to me sounds like the weirdest thing, which means it must probably be true because there's so many freaking weird pastors out there who are insecure. But I just go I love the idea that I could be the worst preacher on our team. Like that thrills me actually, because that would mean, man, everybody's getting something good.
That elder teaching thing, that was a huge question that popped up multiple times, not only in the lead up to our elder training day, but also during the elder training day. And it seems like there is this fixation on the only environment where somebody could teach or preach has to be the primo environment, meaning the most people at one single time. And we work very, very hard at Ironwood to develop the next generation of leaders to the point where we have environments and specific things set aside to develop those leaders.
Well, like we've talked before, I think it's come up on here about a thing we've done where we'll have, 3 different services.
Yeah.
And we'll have 3 developing preachers each take one of the services. But one of the things I have to do in that is I work very hard to set the bar super low, right? So like I get up and go, hey, listen, everybody, you are here to see history. You are going to see someone give his very first sermon. And this is so cool because you have no idea where God's going to take him and how this is going to go. But my first sermon was terrible. And, but I'm so glad I got a second sermon, and I'm so glad that people were willing to listen to a first, right? And I just lower that bar and I go, so cheer them on, and then because I've worked with them and they're guys that have some gifts, like I know that I can set the bar low enough that they can actually get over it. And then everyone's like, man, they were so great. That's so cool. Right. And it becomes this big win, so that's something that I can do once a year or every couple of years when I'm doing one of those things. But if some elder gets up because, well, it's his week to speak. Now, in our church, that wouldn't work great because we're a larger church where people are used to a certain level of communication skill. That's one of the things that I think we have to realize is like, as a preacher improves in his communication skill, the congregation gets used to hearing a level of communication. And at that point, now you have to actually keep having communicators that are at about that level, or the congregation will perceive them as not very trustworthy, even if they're totally trustworthy. So that's the dilemma. My father-in-law is at a very small church, and he preaches every so often at his church. And I think he does a great job for what he does in that church and for what that church needs. And so I know all of our elders could do that. And all of them are really godly, great men, or they wouldn't be elders. But if we put a number of them up to preach, they wouldn't want to do it. And after they did it once, most people would go, I hope they don't ever do it again. And I go, I don't want them to think, I don't want people to feel like that about the greatest guys in our church.
Yeah. What are some of the other environments around campus where preaching or large group communication is happening and there's more reps than just on Sunday morning?
Well, in Sunday morning, there's the announcements, the welcome, the hosting, that sort of
that's
thing.
A great point.
That's a really tough environment. If someone can be good in the announcements, I think they're good.
Yeah.
Like as a communicator. That said, I think because someone's not very good at that doesn't mean they're bad. It's just a really, really hard. I mean, it's like when you're on a flight and the flight attendants are trying to like get you to figure out how to buckle a seatbelt. You're like, I've been in a car for my whole life. I get how this works. On the other hand, communion is another place. So at our church, we do communion every week. I actually think communion is a better place to help cultivate like the preaching moment, because communion is much more like a very mini preaching moment than announcements are. So I think those are some places in the Sunday morning experience. A lot of this depends on the church size, but there might be a men's Bible study, or there might be a men's breakfast, or student ministry, or junior high, or high school, or young adults, or college, or senior adults. There's all kinds of environments like that. We've had times where we've created classes and we've intentionally put someone as the teacher of that class, not because necessarily we really had this big need to run this class, but because this was interesting enough, we thought people would sign up, and it gives them reps. So that's things that you can do. The other things that I would encourage guys to do if they're trying to develop other preachers is, figure out who's doing FCA in your community. Every high school that has FCA needs speakers, and just say yes to all those opportunities. In some environments, there might be nursing homes or assisted living homes, and they do Bible studies and chapel type things, and those are all great places to cut your teeth. For me, one of the things I got to do here in Phoenix, I realize not most people could do this, but in Phoenix, there was a number of years where I was a baseball chaplain for the Oakland A's for their minor league system, and I would go over and teach a lesson to 7 guys every week. 2 of them spoke Spanish, and just kind of nodded along with me, But that was a chance for me to get reps. So all of those environments are the ways that you improve your skills.
Now, before we get to my last question, which is all about how to build that team if it's just you, there is a role for guest speakers. What is your approach to the use of guest speakers? How are you finding them? Are you paying them? Are you doing pulpit swaps? What's your thoughts on guest speakers?
Guest speakers can be really great because just the fact that they're different, especially if they're good, the fact that they're different means they can say something that you've said a million times, but it feels fresh, right? It's just exactly like with your kids. Like when there's something you've told your kids 100 times and like one of their coaches says it and it's like, he said blah, 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 blah. And internally you're like, I freaking told you that a million times, but really you're just happy that it landed finally, right?
Uh-huh.
So I think that's one of the values of guest speakers. Again, they can be fresh voices. We have found those typically. I'm connected with a lot of pastors here in town. It's nice to have other pastors in town come. I'm not worried about, oh man, that guy's going to be so good and people are going to leave our church and go to his church. If that happens, that happens. If people are willing to leave because of something that flimsy, then I'd hope they go. Like that's fine with me. So there's another pastor that's 20 minutes away, and he preached this spring for us, and he did awesome. And nobody left our church to go to his church. But the reason I like that is because I don't have to fly him in. I don't have to put him in a hotel, and I don't have to rent him a car. I can give him a nice honorarium, but they can just come and preach and do that. So a lot of times it's the relationships. In the early days of our church, I would find youth pastors of other churches where this guy is as good as I am, maybe better, but he's not good enough at his big mega church to get a Sunday, but he's still pretty good. And now he can come and we can give him a couple $100 and he can get a rep on Sunday and I can get a week off, and it's like win, win, win. That's just great. So we do that. I do know of a couple churches, this is interesting, where one of the things they've done, and this is probably in a larger environment, they've actually contracted with a guest speaker to do a certain number of weeks. So, this person, and maybe they live in town, maybe they don't, but it's like almost a consistent guest speaker to the point where they almost become part of your preaching team. So here's this guy, and he's going to come in 8 weeks a year, and they've contracted with that person. And what that allows them to do is to get a really high level communicator, and to have them around enough where that person's voice becomes understood and it feels cohesive. And they actually at that point start feeling less like a guest speaker and more like just one of the preachers. So those are a few ways that I've seen it done.
So there is a reality that a lot of churches, their staff is either a bivocational lead pastor with maybe a part-time administrator or some variation of that, full-time, part-time administrator, maybe a part-time music person or a part-time student pastor. Whether it's that or slightly bigger, if you're trying to start developing this team, what would you say would be some good steps to take to get there? And I realize it's going to vary because of size and whatnot, but what are some universal steps that could be adapted? And if you had to do it over again?
The first one would be to help the board and the elders buy in to the vision of a team and the vision of developing other preachers. I think there's plenty of environments where people would go, "Oh, team? That's what you're here for. You're the senior pastor. You need to preach most weeks. Like, what do you mean team?" Like, they would really scoff some church elders at like the idea of lead pastor preached 33 times. What do you do the rest of it? I mean, that's 20 Sundays off almost, right? Like that can feel lazy or
Must be nice.
Yeah, that kind of thing. And so I would say begin to cast a vision, and I would not at all emphasize that I need a break. What I would emphasize is we want to be a leadership development hub. We want to be the kind of church that makes disciples and develops leaders, where young, bright leaders in our community and the seminaries around us want to be here because they know there are going to be opportunities to actually get to play in the game, right? Cast a leadership development vision. And the benefit of that will be, it will also allow you to get more of a breather. But I would start there, because otherwise there will just be internal resistance to the idea of even having a team. So I would start with that. Then I would really think about, okay, who do you have that has giftedness here? It's not like, well, they could if they needed to, they could if they had to, but there's actually some gift. Like there's some, when they talk, people listen. Like that, there's something there. So start with those people, and start with the people who really want to do it. Unfortunately, not everybody who really wants to be a good preacher
That's what I was thinking.
is always gifted.
Yeah.
But the chances are that they're more likely to be gifted than the people who,
and maybe even
don't
more
wanna
likely
go
to work at it.
Certainly.
And put in the time.
Yeah.
Than somebody who is like, I don't even want to be up here.
Yeah. I would not, unless there are people you really know well and you've really heard them preach before in other environments, I would not right out of the gate say, hey, I want you to be part of our preaching team. I think I've seen some guys get in trouble because they've overpromised that. And then not very long into it, it's like, he actually isn't as good, or his character's not as what I thought it was, or, you know what, we're actually not that aligned on vision, or whatever the thing might be. And now you got to like unwind the guy that's part of the preaching team. How come he's not on the preaching team anymore? And so I would just do it like, hey, would you, could I put you in this time to preach? And then they do well. Hey, is this something you'd be interested in doing a few more times? And, you do that with a couple of people, and you start to see, okay, who develops. I would get our preaching, sermon evaluation form and use that or some other method. I mean, we've talked about preaching through, feedback and giving them feedback, giving them coaching, invest in some sort of preaching course for them, something that's going to help them get the building blocks of this. Because what you would eventually like is to have a few people, maybe they're lay people, maybe they're on staff, but they're the kind of person who could do an effective sermon 4, 5, 6, 10 times a year. I would start with who's really willing, who seems to have some gifts. I would give them an occasional opportunity on a Sunday, but I'd really pump them in those other environments. And then the challenge is you got to go watch them in some of those environments, because you want to be able to give them feedback. And then just count on that this is going to take years. It's going to be a long time. There's going to be a lot of people who eventually you go, nope, they don't really have it, or they aren't really willing to put the work in, or, they talk a big game, but they don't really follow through. And we give them these deadlines, but they don't hit it. And, when they preach, it turns into a big circus because they're just emotionally unstable. And you're just going to run in. I mean, that's what discipleship is. That's what leadership is. But that's how I would begin that process. And if you could get to a point where you do most of the preaching by even quite a lot, but then you have one other person who can handle 6 or 8 weeks a year, and then you fill in the gaps with some guests, like that'd be pretty great. And you'd be better off for it. Your church, I think, would be served by that. And then eventually, if you have people, where like, man, there's really some gift here, then you do it even more.
You mentioned evaluation. We have a previous episode, Preaching Through Feedback, and one of the comments that you made, I don't remember the wording exact, but it was like, evaluate to your expectations, form your evaluation based upon whatever your expectations are. And I just think that could be a very helpful tool as you give more leeway to someone, or give more opportunity, or you try to pull it back. It gives you a backbone to go with. And as you were talking about not over asking at the very beginning, I would always approach any position that I was trying to fill with a volunteer, whether it was big or small, just with like, hey, I need some help for the next 4 weeks, or I need some help for the next 6 weeks, fully intending that if this works out, I'm going to say I need help for the next 6 months. But if it doesn't, then we reach those 4 weeks. Hey, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And
yep.
it I got what I needed.
Yep.
I got the information that I needed, and I can move on. And then if you have that evaluation, you can say, hey, I really would like for you to help me for the next 6 months, but based upon these things, I really need these. Do you think you can deliver these things? Can you meet these deadlines? Can you incorporate these things into it? So I thought that was great. And I would encourage people to go back and listen to the sermon evaluation, the Preaching Through Feedback episode. And then there's the form you can download. But is there anything else that you would say about this team aspect, this preaching team aspect before we're all done?
Two things come to mind. One is, don't be surprised when people who don't preach a lot get really great feedback from the congregation.
Yeah.
Just know a lot of it's because it's different. They're not really that good, but, especially when they're new. They're, and so that's one of the things that's hard when you're developing a guy is he'll preach once and it's like, man, everybody loved it. Like they all told me how great it was. Why don't I preach more? And it's like, well, they loved it because you're just different. It's not because you're necessarily that great yet. And so there is some kind of coaching that you have to do of the younger guy, and then just your own security to go, yeah, I actually want them to get a lot of encouragement, but I'm going to try to be like the actual sober-minded evaluator of where they're at. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is just there's a big contextual dynamic to this too, is just like eventually an elder team would have to buy into a team environment. There's different churches that are more or less comfortable with this. There's actually a church that I've got really close relationships with, and they have a team of about 4 guys, and their team is they literally go preacher A 1 week, preacher B the next week, preacher C the third week, preacher D the fourth week, and then they just keep going. It's just A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, A, B. It's literally it's not just a preaching team, it's a preaching rotation. Now, I don't personally care for that. I think in our context, people would feel like jostled around by that. But in that church, it really works great. And so that's the thing is I think it's good to have an ideal of building toward a team, but also be patient with people. Because if they're not used to this, it really will take them time. Not only will it take you time to develop the people, it'll take the church time to feel okay with it. The context of it matters a lot.
You could be if that was for me, I've never been in an environment where that's the case, 40 years, since I can remember.
Yeah.
And I've never been in an environment where that's a rotation has been the case. And that would take some jolting.
Sure.
And that would be something to get used to. Well, hey, thanks so much for listening to this episode. Hope you enjoyed it. We enjoy all these conversations. And if there's something in particular that you would love some insight on, or at least to just hear what our thoughts are, you can decide whether or not it's insightful. You can send a message to info@faithfulandfruitful.com. And we'd just love to hear from you. Everything that you might want from this episode in terms of references, faithfulandfruitful.com/406. There's a whole lot of episodes that we have already released. I'd encourage you to go back, take a look, and see which ones are relevant to your context here and now. And we've got more on the way. So really appreciate you spending a little bit of time, and we'll see you next episode. Bye-bye.